Mike Schaff.
Talking over life's unanswered questions.
BBC Radio Manchester.
Well, we certainly got a big question today. Many of us woke on Bank Holiday Monday to the news that Americans had been waiting for almost 10 years. Osama bin Laden had been found and was killed. Reactions on the streets of Washington were joyous, but since that day, faith leaders in the UK have spoken out over the reaction of the US and of the way in which he was killed. With me this morning to discuss the issue is Rev Hayley Matthews, Media City chaplain and member of the Christian community, Rabbi Benji Rickman, head of Jewish studies, a teacher and a member of the Jewish community, and Mohammed Amin, treasurer of the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester, and he writes on Muslim affairs. Can I wish you all a very good morning and a very warm welcome?
Good morning.
Good morning, Mike.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Let's start off with this question. What did you make of the news this week? Let's start off with you, Mohammed.
I heard the news at exactly 7 o'clock on Monday morning because I always wake up to BBC Radio 4. And I'll be quite honest, my reaction is as soon as I heard the news inside, I just went, yes. I was delighted. I would have liked to have been arrested and brought back for trial like Adolf Eichmann was. But if that wasn't possible, then it was entirely appropriate to kill him.
Reverend Hayley.
I was dismayed that he had been killed and not brought to trial. Dismayed that that was the action that was taken in what seemed to be, judging by the first reports that we heard, an incident where he could have been.
And Rabbi.
I was relieved that no Americans were injured or killed in the operation, relieved that an evil person was taken out of the world, but it wasn't an emotional sense of joy, but more of a sense of justice had been served.
If you looked at the reaction on the streets in America, there was joy.
There was, but I think that so typifies the exuberance of American culture anyway, that sense of celebration and over-the-top reaction to most things. I was actually in Manhattan the day of 9/11, and I wandered the streets in the afternoon, and there was a sense of disbelief. People weren't walking normally, they were walking in a daze. And so those who were there, I think, had a right to celebrate, but I think perhaps the rest of the world should be cautious at that over-the-top celebration.
What did you make of the reaction of the people on the streets in America?
One thing to remember is that this was pub closing time in the United States. And a lot of the people who were on the streets outside the White House just after Obama's announcement had actually been to the pub. So it's understandable that they were perhaps somewhat more enthusiastic than you might be in the cold light of day. However, you need to bear in mind this was the greatest attack that the United States has ever suffered since Pearl Harbor, and the third greatest one-day loss of life that America has ever experienced. And in that situation, you want to go and get the bad guy. This is a man who's also killed and been responsible for killing thousands of Muslims all around the world.
I don't think there's ever a reason to celebrate somebody being murdered. I think actually we all share in a common humanity, and to actually have a sense of dismay and despair about the fact that we still think that killing somebody is the right way to go about any form of justice. I just think it's appalling that we would celebrate death full stop. We talk about this loss of life in America, 3,000 in one day. Look at the civilians in Afghanistan that are continuing to be killed. You know, what was it? 7 to 13-year-olds, 9 of them on March the 1st this year that were killed by American troops. Have any of us heard about those children? We need to think about loss of life on both sides.
We have a ritual on Passover, and obviously we celebrate the freedom from slavery in the ancient Israelites. And we talk about the death of the Egyptians during the 10 plagues that God brought over Egypt. And one of our rituals is we're sitting at the Seder table, the Passover table, with cups of wine to celebrate the freedom. And we remove a drop of wine from the cup each time one of the plagues are mentioned. Because even though, from our perspective of ancient Jewish history, we were the victors, because there was death, people suffered. Even if they were our enemies, our celebration has to be limited, even in the smallest degree, of a drop of wine for each of the 10 plagues. So we celebrate justice being served. We can celebrate that the image of God that's expressed in the decent people of society can be seen in a clearer way. But to rejoice at at someone losing their life, that's not a Jewish approach to this type of situation.
Something that's been widely discussed is should he have been arrested? How do you, all three of you, handle the argument that had he been arrested, then there would be retaliations to try and get him released?
I wanted him arrested. I'm sure the American government wanted him arrested. We don't have second-by-second details of exactly what was going on, and the Navy SEALs had to take split-second decisions. I feel confident that if bin Laden had been standing there with his hands up saying, OK, take me in, he would not have been shot.
I think actually bringing someone to justice through a court of law is very important. And I think this whole idea of reprisals, if he'd been taken and arrested, I mean, what would the reprisals be from the fact that he's now been killed and that people are describing him as a martyr? I think actually that fuels a fire that's slightly more worrying.
As Mohammed mentioned before, when Adolf Eichmann was taken, he stood trial, but his persona was not the same as bin Laden today. I think there is a concern that he might have been a difficult person to hold in any type of jail, and it would have been a complicated security issue. But I think we can't escape the political issue that Obama wanted to be re-elected, and so we're looking from a faith perspective, how much truth, absolute moral truth, went into the operation, how much was there political agenda to try and make a big stand of things, show that he was a brave leader, can take serious decisions. Because that was one of the things that he's been accused of, Obama, by his adversaries in America, that he's not a brave leader, not a decisive leader. And I think he was looking not so much as the moral arbiter of the world, but to get re-elected.
I want to ask all three of you this next question. What does your faith say about justification and revenge?
It says that we should turn the other cheek. It says that we're all about forgiveness and grace. And I think that the idea that we're working on an eye for an eye just isn't part of the Christian faith.
For Jews, the Torah makes it clear that God's given judges and nations the ability to execute judgment. Forgiveness is not for us to forgive those who wrong us. Those who have wronged us have to ask us to be forgiven. So there's no sense in Judaism that you have to go around forgiving people who are evil. They have to come to you. And it's now it's body and soul. When body and soul separated, the soul's being judged by God, and it's for God to judge him as God sees fit.
The basic principle in Islam is that if your relative has been murdered, then you are the person who is in a position to forgive the person who's carried out the murder. That's often associated with the payment of blood money. And if it's up to you whether you choose to take it or whether you choose to demand that the person is tried and executed, the killer. But ultimately, forgiveness is regarded as a good thing, but the right to forgive belongs to the victims.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, let me ask you this. I want your thoughts on the media's portrayal of what went on last Sunday night, Monday morning. Any thoughts?
I think we're living in a society not much different from the ancient pagan world of bloodlust. And we have such a desire to witness the loss of blood or to see evil fall, and it's a depraved state. The media's ad nauseum gone on and on about this all week. We heard the news repeatedly for days, and it was on every website had it for days. It was just enough already.
I think, again, we're looking at projecting all of our evil onto a person. We talk about Osama bin Laden, he murdered people. Well, I mean, look at the refusal to provide drugs to the HIV community over in Africa. 24 million people have died so far. Well, is that not an act of genocide? We're actually projecting all of the ways that we murder people on a day-to-day basis onto this one man who has killed 3,000 people in one incident. Is being told, we're told that he's responsible for that. But I mean, we're all responsible for the deaths of one another on a daily basis. And I just don't understand why we don't look at the way we refuse to collaborate, we refuse to talk to one another, and we refuse to look at different ways of doing things apart from, well, we're just going to murder somebody else. It's never the answer.
It depends on which media you follow. The BBC, the New York Times, which I read electronically, the Financial Times, the quality of the coverage has been very good, very detailed, as new information has been coming out over the week.
Which part of the BBC?
BBC Radio 4. Mm-hmm. So the quality of the coverage has been very good. As more information has been coming out as the week went on, as the Americans debriefed the SEALs who carried out the operation, I felt that the coverage in those media sources had been very good. I can't speak for the tabloids because I don't read them.
And should this be a rolling news story for almost 48 hours?
No. I actually think it does fuel the whole idea that there will be reprisals and that this guy is going to become a martyr. And it continues to fuel disaffected people who may actually take up that baton. I think it's quite dangerous.
And what do you make of the way the news changed from what the Americans said actually happened on day one to what they were saying actually happened on day 3, for instance?
The Americans were too quick to want to get their side of the story out. I understand that they were concerned that Al-Qaeda would get its version out more quickly. So almost as soon as the operation was over, you had American spokespeople talking about the firefight. Later on, as they debriefed the SEAL commandos, they found that actually only one person had been firing at the Americans right at the beginning. And that's the fog of war. If you try to get your story out too quickly, you risk getting it wrong, and then it's embarrassing to have to correct it. But these are minor matters. And coming back to your earlier question, 48 hours of coverage, I don't regard that as at all excessive. 9/11 was the biggest news story that's happened in the last 40 years. And certainly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the death of Osama bin Laden was not quite as newsworthy as 9/11, but it was a major item of news.
But how long should it go on for? He's dead.
Yes.
The end.
Well, after this weekend, I think it will wind down, unless new information comes out. However, if new information comes out, that is also newsworthy. We've had videos released now that from the material that was captured, when he was killed.
I think for me, it underlines perhaps the lack of moral clarity in this whole operation. If it was simply an act of justice or morality, whatever word language you want to use, it would have been on the news, and then it would have faded away. But this constant drip drap of bringing in different versions every day undermines the moral clarity of the operation.
And of course, there is, by everybody, it would seem these days, news management. And the Americans can now stretch this out for as long as they want by releasing this today, something else tomorrow, something else the day after.
Well, it's whether we pick it up or not, isn't it?
But we pick it up automatically.
Those videos that have been released, we're never going to know the truth about those videos.
Yeah.
They've obviously edited them very carefully for the Western consumption. And then the question, again, it doesn't help anything, because then the other side will say, you're not showing the truth, you've edited it carefully, and it just fuels the drama, it fuels the conspiracy theories. It doesn't actually bring closure, which I think what people want to have is closure. The American reaction was closure from the event. And they saw the firefighters die, they saw the ambulancemen die, the police, and the people who came to help. They want it to go away, they want it to move on after a decade of difficulties, perhaps to move on with their lives. Perhaps people are now going to go and remarry, start new families, because they can end this moment of darkness in their lives. And this media friendly is just going to keep this going, and unfortunately keep the pain going for many of them as they feed on this media.
Well, is it news or is it propaganda? That's what I would say.
To my mind, it was clearly news. And the story of Al-Qaeda isn't over yet. We have to find Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's number 2. We've got people in the Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who is inspiring people to try to commit new acts of terrorism. This is an organization that has to be arrested or destroyed.
Is that ever going to happen? Can you destroy an organization that is so diverse?
You can destroy the central command of the organization. You can make it impossible to operate. The idea behind Al-Qaeda is an idea that you have to combat with ideas. You don't combat ideas with military force, but Al-Qaeda as an organization was committing acts of terrorism, and as an organization, it needs to be arrested or destroyed.
We're going to break here for the traffic and travel, and then we'll be joined after that by Reverend Jane Shaw, who's in fact the only female Anglican vicar who's worked in Pakistan.
Mike Shafts, BBC Radio Manchester.
Well, joining our discussion now is Reverend Jane Shaw. Reverend Shaw has worked in Pakistan. She returned from there last September. Now, I know, Reverend Shaw, you haven't been able to listen to the other parts of our discussion, but we want to bring you in to get your reactions, first of all, to the news this week.
Well, it was quite a shock and surprise. I mean, I know Abbottabad quite well. I've been there several times. I've lived nearby for a while. And I thought, this is a relatively small community and a very heavily militarized cantonment. It seemed very surprising that anybody could live there without the security forces being well aware. So that slightly surprised me.
Give me an idea of life in Pakistan, because it's something we've discussed on this program before. Is it a state where there is no law, for instance? Because we seem to hear more and more about people being executed, being killed for minor things. I'm not talking about bin Laden now. I'm talking about things that's gone on there in recent months.
Oh no, there is law. There is a good legal system, actually based still on the old British framework, pre-1947, moderated to be in line with Sharia law. There is police, there are courts, there are judges. The whole legal system is there. But it doesn't necessarily work as well as it does in a Western country, because there is a lot of corruption and things, go wrong.
What did you make of the way the Americans, some Americans, celebrated the death of bin Laden?
Humanly, I understand it very well. They've been through terrible traumas. They've been led to attribute this to this one man, and now the one man has been removed. So there would be naturally the sort of rejoicing that our parents might have felt when Hitler died. The figurehead is very critical to people's understanding. I was taken aback, I think, by the manner of his death. It seemed very summary execution. And I was impressed by a speaker on Thought for the Day last week who said that after the last World War, justice was moderated through the Nuremberg trials. There was evidence, there were witnesses, there was a judgment. But a gunshot at 4 o'clock in the morning is, well, it's almost more like terrorist activity.
And there's been a lot of discussion, and I want to bring Mohammed in on this one first of all, please, about the way in which he was buried. What were your thoughts on that?
I can understand the reasons for doing it, and basically I support them. If bin Laden had been buried on the ground, his tomb would have become a shrine to the people who think like he does. As it was, his body was treated the Muslim way. It may well have been actually prepared by Muslims. There are many Muslims who serve in the American Armed Forces. And I'm sure the Americans are quite capable of getting some to help prepare the body and then bury it at sea. This way, there will never ever be a shrine to bin Laden.
Reverend Jane?
Well, I suspect there will be a shrine to bin Laden because people create shrines wherever, and there may even be one in Abbottabad quite soon. But in terms of the way in which his death was, his burial was executed, I see that will cause some unease and offence among some strict Muslims. And that maybe just goes with the package. That's something that, with the other outrage and the other offence, it becomes part of the story.
There seems to have been lots of discussion as to how bin Laden was able to stay in, effectively, a city in Pakistan for this length of time without being spotted, without getting caught. Are we wrong to blame the people of Pakistan?
Oh yes, I don't think the people of Pakistan come into it necessarily. Now, I was surprised, and I wonder whether the security forces did actually know who the guest was. I'm sure the house is in the name of one of the tribal chiefs, and so his name doesn't appear. But they have a pretty shrewd idea who comes and goes. But I don't think, that is a matter for the security forces, and really the military in Pakistan are almost a parallel universe. They interact occasionally with the ordinary population, but I don't think the people of Pakistan can be blamed. They're more the victims, really.
Another big discussion point in the week has been the photographs. Rabbi, first of all, your thoughts on that, and should the photos be released?
I don't think so. I don't think people need to witness the dead body. If we want to accept we're living in a Western democracy where we have to have some sense of we trust and we believe heads of government, heads of state, and I think being told that he's been killed, we have to accept that. Conspiracy theories will always question the truth of a photograph anyway. And I think it's just, again, it's that sense of bloodlust that many people seem to want to revel in rather than the truth of the death of an enemy of most of the world.
Reverend Hayley Matthews?
Yeah, I would agree. Actually, it is the whole bloodlust and YouTube videos and that kind of culture. It's not really appropriate, is it, for something of this stature?
Al-Qaeda has already put out a statement accepting that bin Laden was killed.
It took a few days for them to do that.
It did, but they put it out. Publishing photographs would not actually convince those people who still think he's alive. People still think Elvis Presley is alive. So there's nothing to be gained by publishing the photos. It will make more people angry, and therefore I think Obama has made the right decision. I would encourage him to stick to it.
Reverend Jane?
Well, it was funny. I used to joke in Pakistan that people didn't believe something had happened until they had the photograph of it. You know, birthday parties, weddings, whatever. They were insistent the photographs had to be taken, and it was almost what made the event real. So maybe that's a local cultural thing, but on the general principle, I would agree with the previous speakers.
And what do you think is going to happen now? Where does this story go?
Well, I pray that it won't cause more backlash, more outrage, particularly against the Christians of Pakistan, who always seem to be vulnerable to revenge attacks. So I will pray that it just becomes part of the ongoing series of events and doesn't cause further trouble.
Well, Reverend Jane Shaw, only female Anglican vicar to have worked in Pakistan, can I thank you very much indeed for taking part in our discussion this morning.
Thank you, I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And my guests here in the studio were Rabbi Benji Rickman, Mohammed Amin, and Reverend Hayley Matthews. We're right out of time. I will take one of you, please. Where do you think the story's going to go from here?
I think the high tide of Islamically motivated extremism has gone. The Arab Spring that we've seen in Tunisia, in Egypt, what we're seeing in Libya, what we're seeing in Syria, means that the whole story has moved on. And I think in 20 years' time, we'll look back at a period of religiously motivated extremism and we will say, thank God it's over.
But what's going on in the Arab Spring, that's going to bring a different kind of government to those areas, isn't it?
Yes, I believe it will bring democratic government to those areas.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed for taking time to be with us on a fascinating discussion. And we move on.